Well, hello there and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Casey and I'm the designer behind the indie sewing pattern company, Pattern Scout. Today, I'm going to be showing you a sew along for the Romy Wrap top. And this is a pattern that I sell in my shop, and it is also available as a dress length. And I decided to lengthen the sleeves and turn them into a bishop style sleeve. And originally I was thinking, okay, I'll just show you how to hack the sleeve into a bishop style. But then I decided to just go ahead and draft a pattern and provide a free pattern for you so that if you have the Romy Wrap top, or if you'd like to buy the Romy Wrap top, you can get the sleeve pattern added on to that for free. So I put a link in the description below to both the original Romy Wrap top and dress pattern and the bishop sleeve add-on if you'd like to go grab that. The pattern is available in US sizes 0 through 30 and also includes bust cup options. So it has a B cup, a C cup, and a D cup option included in the pattern. So if you typically have to do a full bust adjustment for a C cup or D cup, you don't have to do that for this pattern. It's already done for you, and it'll make it a little bit easier to get a great fit with less effort. A few of the techniques that we'll be covering in this tutorial include sewing pleats and a yoke and flat felled seams and French seams so that we have a very beautifully finished blouse. Okay, let's get right into the sew along. For this project, I'm going to be using this viscose silk twill that I picked up from Measure Fabric. I'll put a link in the description for that. And this fabric is kind of a medium to lightweight fabric. To start, I cut out all of my pattern pieces. So I have 2 front bodice pieces, 1 back bodice piece cut on the fold, 2 front facing pieces, 2 back yoke pieces, 2 front skirt pieces mirrored, and 1 back skirt piece cut on the fold. And of course, 2 sleeves. Now I can prep my facings. So I cut 2 pieces of interfacing to match the facings mirrored, and the interfacing has a smooth side and a rough side. I'm going to put the smooth side face down on the right side of fabric, so these are basically right sides together. Then I'm going to pin along that outer curved edge and sew along the edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, I'll flip these right side out, so I'm just kind of finger pressing that facing away before I iron it to get it in place, and then I will press the interfacing to the facing to adhere it. And I'll do this for both of the facings, and this just gives a really nice, neat, clean finish for the facings instead of having a raw edge. I'll set the facings aside for now because I want to prep the bodice. So there are notches on the bodice pieces, both the front and the back, where you will install pleats. And I'm just folding those pleats at the notches, making sure the notches kiss, and the pleat will point toward the center front from the wrong side and toward the shoulder from the right side. There are also pleats at the waistline. And again, those will point toward the center front from the wrong side and toward the side seam from the right side. And you can see I've just got those pinned. So I went and ironed those and basted those in place. And I did that for both of the front bodice pieces. And I also have pleats on the back bodice piece. So I've got 2 at the bottom and 2 at the top. And they both point toward the shoulders and side seams from the right side, and again toward the center from the wrong side. With the bodice laying face up, I want to attach the peplum skirt to the bodice. And you'll notice that the straight edge of the skirt is going to be at the side of the side seam. So I'm just aligning that waist seam along the peplum skirt with the waist seam of the bodice and pinning that in place, and I'll sew that with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'll do the same thing for the back bodice. These curved parts right here are actually the arm side, that's the top. So you want to flip that over and make sure you're doing this at the waistline. Again, attaching the peplum skirt at the waist to the waistline of the back bodice. And I'm just pinning that in place, and I'll sew that with a 5/8 inch seam allowance as well. Once I've sewn that for both front bodices and the back bodice, I'm going to finish that seam with a flat felled seam. So I'm just trimming away the bodice side of the seam allowance, the bodice side only, down to about 1/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to press both seam allowances toward the peplum skirt, and I'll flip it over and kind of press it nice and flat on the right side as well. Then I'm going to fold over the opposite side over that seam that I just trimmed and press that in place. Then I'll fold that again toward the bodice to conceal both of those raw edges in that fold and press that along the entire length of the waistline. I'll do this for both of the front bodice pieces and for the back bodice. After I get those seams pressed, I'm going to top stitch along that fold just to keep it in place and make sure that those seams stay concealed. I'm taking my time with this because I'm doing it from the right side of fabric, so every now and then I'll kind of check and make sure that the folds are still nicely pressed underneath. And I'll do this again for both of the front bodice pieces and the back bodice. And you can see that that creates a nice seam finish and all of our raw edges are concealed. So now I can attach those facings to the front bodice pieces. So I'm aligning these right sides together along that wrap edge and pinning this in place. And I'm taking my time, just making sure I get everything matched up nice and neat. And you kind of have to sort of squish this into place and ease it into place. It will fit. I did not stay stitch this, so don't come for me. But even with stay stitching, this can be a little tricky sometimes to line up just because it's cut on the bias, so just take your time with this. And I'll attach the facing to the bodice with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. When I reach the bottom end of the facing, I'm going to stop and pivot around the 3 edges of that facing, and this will make sense a little bit later. So you can see there, I just kind of maintained that 5/8 inch seam allowance along those 2 extra edges at the bottom. Now I'm going to trim my seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm using my rotary cutter here. If you've watched my channel before, you know that I have had accidents with my rotary cutter. Just be really careful. Then you're going to press the facing away from the bodice and press the seam allowance toward the facing. So we're going to get all of that nice and pressed all the way down, and I'll flip that over and press it nice and flat on the exterior side as well. Next, I'm going to understitch that seam allowance to the facing from the exterior side. And I'm going to try to get as close as I can to that corner, but it's okay if you don't get all the way to the corner. You just want to get that seam allowance attached to the facing, which will help keep that facing turned toward the inside of the bodice. And I'm stopping and back stitching right as close as I can get to that corner, but about 1 inch away. Next, I will turn all of this right side out and poke out the corners at the bottom of that facing edge and press this toward the interior of the bodice. You'll also notice down at the bottom of the facing here that edge is kind of turned under where the peplum skirt attaches to the facing. That's just going to help us kind of conceal that hem. Once we do the hem there, it'll be nicely concealed within the facing. And I'll turn this over and press it from the right side. I just want to press this really well. Next, I'm going to press a 5/8 inch fold into just one of the yoke pieces at the bottom edge. So I'm just measuring that with my seam gauge and pressing that along the entire bottom edge of this yoke. With the other side of the yoke, the one that's not pressed, I'm going to lay that face up and I'm going to attach the front bodice pieces at the shoulder seams. So I'm just pinning these in place, and you'll have some overlap at the shoulder on the yoke, and that is what you want. You want it to be about 5/8 of an inch extra overhanging the edge, and I'm going to sew it with a 5/8 inch seam allowance at the shoulder. Once I get those sewn, I'm going to fold back that front wrap edge so that it's clear of the neckline of the yoke, and I'm pinning the yoke again to the back yoke, sandwiching the front bodice shoulder in between the two. I'm doing this on both sides. And then I'm just going to pin around the neckline of the yoke, making sure that that bodice is out of the way. And I'll sew all of this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around the shoulders and the neckline. And again, I just want to restate that you want to make sure that the bodice wrap edge is out of the way of the seam allowance. With that sewn, I'm going to trim down the seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch all the way around. I'm using my rotary cutter at the shoulder seams, and I'm actually going to use scissors around the neckline just to make sure that I don't make any errant cuts with my rotary cutter. Next, I'll turn all of this right side out, and you can see how that works now with the shoulder seams nicely encased within that yoke. I've pressed this flat with my iron, and I'm just going around and edge stitching that yoke at the neck seam and shoulder seams to give it a nice clean finish. Now we can attach the back bodice. So I've got this folded edge here, it's still free. I'm going to flip this over so that the front bodice and yoke are face up, and I'm pinning the back bodice along the yoke just to that exterior side only. I'm going to sew that with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now I can grade that seam allowance down. So to grade, I'm just going to cut one side of the seam allowance down to about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm using my scissors for that, making sure that I'm not cutting the folded side of the yoke that is still free. Then I'll use my rotary cutter to just cut the other side with about 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is just going to kind of step down that seam allowance so it's not too bulky underneath the yoke. I've taken this over to the ironing board and I'm going to press that seam allowance up into the yoke. Then I'll fold down that interior yoke piece that has the fold pressed in it, and I'm going to align that fold just a hair over that seam allowance and top stitch along the exterior side to secure that in place and conceal all of the raw edges of the bodice and the yoke on the interior of the yoke. And I'm checking every so often to remove my pins, making sure that that fold is nice and aligned on the interior so that I'm catching that with this top stitching from the exterior as I go. So you can see that up close. There's the exterior and there's the interior, and if I lift this up you can see that seam. Now we have the bodice mostly attached together and we can work on the sleeves. I want to go ahead and fold in the hem allowance for the sleeve. This will just make it easier to sew that hem and casing later. And then if you have trouble kind of keeping your seams down, you can use a clapper. It's just a wood block to help set those folds in place. Now I've got the entire bodice face up and kind of opened up so that the arm side is opened up, and I'm aligning the sleeve along the arm side, matching the double notches to the back and the front notches to the front of the sleeve cap and the arm side. And then I'll just kind of evenly distribute the sleeve cap the rest of the way. There's also notches on the sleeve to align it to the yoke. And you may have a little bit of waffling there. That's okay. That'll kind of even out. And I'm going to sew this with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm taking my time around the sleeve cap to make sure that I don't have any bunches or gathers in the sleeve cap. You'll notice it kind of starts to even out. And that's because on these curved seams, the outer edge of the curve is going to be longer than where the actual seam allowance is. So that's why it kind of waffles like that, but it should kind of fall into place. And you can see that there, how it's kind of waffly there, but then at the seam allowance, it actually lays nice and flat. Next, I'm going to take this over to the serger and clean up that seam allowance and make sure that those raw edges don't fray, and also trim the seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch to make it more comfortable. I've got a tailor's ham here. You don't have to use a tailor's ham, but I'm just using this to press that seam allowance around that curved edge of the arm side and sleeve cap. I'm pressing that seam allowance toward the sleeve. I'll do this for both sleeves. And then once these are sewn, I'm going to sew the sleeve seam and the side seam with a French seam. So I've got this wrong sides together first, and I've kind of unfolded that hem edge there. And I've sewn it with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to trim that down to about 1/8 inch. And again, I'm kind of using a combo of my rotary cutter and my scissors so that I don't cut into the actual bodice. Then I'll turn that wrong side out, press it flat, and sew another seam that is 1/4 inch from the interior that will encase that seam and all of the raw edges for a nice clean finish. Then I'm just going to press that seam allowance toward the back of the bodice and the back of the sleeve on both sides. Now I can hem my sleeve, so you can see I've got those folds that I pressed in the first step. I'm just going to go around the entire sleeve hem with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to stop about 1 inch or so away from where I started just to leave a little opening where I can insert my elastic. So I've grabbed a safety pin here, and I cut a piece of elastic that's about 9 or 10 inches long. You want it to be enough to fit around your wrist plus a little extra so that it's nice and comfortable and not too tight. And I'm just kind of feeding this through the entire sleeve casing, and I'm going to attach these two ends together and then stitch those together at the sewing machine with a zigzag stitch. Once the elastic is secure, I'm just going to slip that back into the casing and close up that little opening I left in the casing before. And that will finish the end of our sleeves and give us a nice poof. And we're almost done. So now we can fold the hem allowance. I'm doing 2 1/4 inch folds at the hem of the peplum skirt, And as you can see, the fold is nicely concealed within the bodice facing. So I'm just gonna do one fold first and press that nice and flat along the entire hem. I'll sew that first fold down, and then I will fold it again and press, and then sew that fold down. It just makes it a little bit easier, especially on these curved edges. It can get a little bit waffly. If you find that your hem wants to curl up like this, just take it over to your ironing board, press it with an iron, and maybe lay a tailor's clapper on top of it, or a book, or a box, just something to kind of help cool that seam down into the shape that you want it. This does help, and it does just take some time sometimes for the seams to kind of relax, and I did this on both the exterior and the interior. And you can also just let it lay flat for a little while and let gravity kind of do the work, or hang it up for a little bit and it'll eventually flatten out. Next, I'm just adding a buttonhole at each end of the wrap front on both sides of the front bodice. And this is right below the waist seam line there. I'll also add a button to each side seam. I'm putting a button on the exterior of the left side seam and anchoring that in that French seam. Again, right below the waist seam, using tape to hold the button in place while I sew it on. I'll also add a button at the right side seam, but this time on the interior, also anchoring that in the French seam and right below that waist seam there. And from the exterior, you can just see a little stitch there where that button is. And the last step is just to open the buttonholes. I've got a rubber mat here, and I'm using my chisel to open up these buttonholes on both sides of that wrap front. And that's basically it. Now you can button the left side into the right side seam and the right side into the left side seam to create your wrap, and it'll be nice and secure. Thank you so much for joining me on this sew along. I hope you found it useful. If you are planning to make the Romy Wrap top, or if you have already made it, first of all, thank you so much for doing that. And second of all, you can share your finished makes on Instagram with the hashtag #PSRomyWrap, and that way others can see what you made. And if you search that hashtag, you can see what other people in the sewing community have made if you're looking for a little bit of extra inspiration for your own project. If you enjoyed the sew along, please be sure to hit subscribe. That way you'll be notified when I release new videos in the future. Okay, I think that is all I have for you today. I will see you in the next video. Bye. Is there anything else I want to say? No, I'm not going to go there. Okay, that's it. Bye-bye.